Good afternoon. Welcome to #GotMoney. Exciting show. When Nicki and I were putting it together, I was really using financial bloodbath as a topic, pretty tongue-in-cheek. And then I spent a good part of the morning reading about the market and did get a bit concerned. I welcome as our great guest, Nicki Hutley from Deloitte. Hello, Nicki. Welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here again.
So, Nicki, is it a financial bloodbath?
Look, I think we've got to be careful in using that sort of hyperbole, very emotive language. We have seen financial markets, go through a roller coaster ride throughout this coronavirus period. And of course, one of the biggest enemies of financial markets is uncertainty. And, we can see this playing out in Victoria, very much so in New South Wales, where we're on a bit of a knife edge here as to which way we're going to tip over the next couple of weeks. And that makes investors very uncertain. Is it a bloodbath for the markets? Probably not. I wouldn't use that term, but look, we're in a very difficult situation. So for people who are about to retire, of course, it's a lot more difficult. And if you are at all worried about the uncertainty and the potential for volatility in the markets, then you want to be thinking about how you're placed, particularly for those getting closer to retirement.
So secure it, lock it down. Be in touch with your financial planner immediately and get in front of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw that you tweeted out the other day, they're planning on decreasing job seekers' payments, and you were opposed to that. And I was really interested to touch on that a little bit with you. Do you want to just unwrap that a little bit for us? Why are you opposed to them decreasing job seekers?
So this goes way back to before the COVID recession. We have at Deloitte Economists, we did modelling 2 years ago for Australian Council of Social Services to show the beneficial impact of a $75 a week rise in what was known as New Start, now Job Seeker. And that was just an artificial amount that we said, all right, we'll show what the benefits are to the economy. And it shows you how that money not only helps those who are often living in what I call Dickensian situations. They don't have enough money to put food on the table for regular meals. Some people are living out of the backs of cars. $40 a day to try and live in a city. If you're trying to find work, that's pretty well where you need to be. And obviously, if you're in the regions, it's even tougher, and often costs of living are higher in the regions. Maybe not for housing, but for food and other essentials. This is not enough for people. So not only was it actually about increasing the basic sort of wage that we pay to those of our most marginalised citizens, but also we could show that those very people actually, because they have so little money, they spend that money. So it gets back into the economy. It goes through what we call the multiplier effect, and it actually creates jobs. It creates more growth. It helps to improve tax revenue. So it has all these positive impacts, particularly in the most disadvantaged areas. So having raised the rate for the period of the coronavirus, if you listen to the language of government now, it's almost like they're saying, and the Treasurer was saying this on the television yesterday morning, it's like, oh, well, we need to sort of see what's happening with the economy. No, you don't. This isn't a question about whether the economy is in a downturn or not. It's a question about what is a reasonable level of support that people on unemployment benefit need to have, irrespective of the broader state of the economy. It's not about incentives or disincentives. That you'd have to raise the rate vast amounts for it to get anywhere near the minimum wage, for it to then be a disincentive. So you can tell I'm very passionate about this subject.
Yeah, and I really like that. And I really wanted to touch on that with you because I agree with you. The idea of the unemployment that's coming, and I was reading this morning, there's suggestions that it's anywhere between 7.4% and 9%. What are you hearing out there when it comes to the unemployment rate?
Yeah, so the official rate at the moment is around 7.4. But if you actually look at the statement put out last week by Treasury, that's the technical reading. So when the Bureau of Statistics rings someone up and says, are you looking for work? And they say yes, then you go tick, you're counted as unemployed. If you say no, then you are counted as being out of the workforce. Now, we know there are hundreds of thousands of people who have left the workforce, so they are not actively looking for a job because they might be stuck at home looking after kids who can't go to school, or you know, at least for a time they couldn't go to school, or daycare, or you might have a job where you don't feel safe to go out because you're a vulnerable person yourself and you can't work from home. There are lots of reasons why those people would have left the workforce. On top of that, there's a whole load of people being attached to their jobs now through the job keeper, that those jobs actually are very vulnerable. We know that there's quite a few that might go. So the effective unemployment rate is probably closer to 15%. Now, the government said both the effective rate will come down, but the real sort of measured rate will rise, to keep rising. Even with all the support we've got, it's going to keep rising to the end of the year to about 9% is where it's probably going to peak. And our forecasts are not that dissimilar. So we've got further to go. There are more job losses on the way.
I was speaking to a gentleman the other day, and he said, you know, we've been looking at a cliff coming. There's a cliff coming. And I think I was looking at the banks this morning, you know, the banks have generously gone ahead and increased the time limit that they're allowing to mortgage holders in temporary relief, which I think is really nice. But is there a point inside of this where we, you know, the banks are never going to get away without their pound of flesh. So what are the consequences of people doing this, and how will the bank get their money back?
Yeah, so the banks at the moment are basically saying to people, not you don't owe us money, but that we will freeze your payments for the time being. Now, some people are paying back just the interest and some people are paying back nothing. If you are not paying back any of the interest, then the amount that you owe, the capital on your loan, is increasing. So they're just adding that interest to the bill that you will eventually have to pay. So there's no Mr. Nice Guy in any of this. They're not giving away money. And in fact, the only reason the banks can do this, because they actually need that money to be coming in for their own balance sheet, otherwise they're in trouble. And the only reason they can do that is because the government is raising special loans through the Reserve Bank for them so that they have that facility to be able to do it. But at the point, which was originally supposed to be in September and now won't be till the new year, you know, there was basically going to be a point at which the banks went, okay, debt holiday's over, back you go to paying your mortgages. Now, of course, if unemployment is still rising, that means there are going to be a whole load of people who can't afford to pay their mortgages who would be flooding the market with homes. We saw this in the 1991 recession. When unemployment gets to the sorts of levels that it is now and going higher, we will see people lose their homes. We will see house prices come down. It is, you know, there will be supply coming on and there will be reduced demand. So it's not a good prospect for the housing market in the short term. And of course, on top of all that, we've got lower levels of migration. So demand's even lower than it would otherwise be, not just because of the unemployment rate, elevated unemployment rate. So housing market's in for, unfortunately, a bit of a tricky period. At the moment, it's kind of holding its ground because those that still have jobs, you know, there seems to be quite a bit of activity still there. But the main thing is that those who have lost jobs at the moment have been, you know, protected a little bit by the job keeper, or they've been able to put their mortgages on hold for a while. But you know, sooner or later, the piper will have to be paid, unfortunately.
Exactly right. I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to touch on, you know, I've got friends that have a really substantial residential property here in Melbourne, and they said to me the other day, do we hold or do we sell? Do we do it now or do we wait? And it's really hard to offer them any kind of advice or comfort, because once we get to the other side of the virus, I'm wondering, as you said, if there's going to be a flood of residential property come to market. And really, that's what you think is going to be a consequence of all of this, don't you?
I do. I think, you know, rising unemployment, lower levels of migration, which is part of our population story, that's leading to more properties that are going to come onto the market at the same time as we have fewer people wanting to buy them. Now, we probably are having fewer new properties built as well, which will help constrain growth a little bit. But don't forget, there's all that supply that we had over the last couple of years before the cycle started to soften. There's a reasonable amount of supply on the market. So if you think about all of those things together, we're probably at the moment in a kind of a bit of a bubble. And look, whilst I won't give investment advice specifically to anyone, and everything depends on your own circumstances. If I were thinking of upgrading at the moment, I would probably test the water to sell a property, because I think prices haven't necessarily come down that much now. And in some places they seem to be holding, or maybe even going up a bit. Hold off, and then maybe in the new year, when things are possibly going to get worse, because we have the mortgage holidays ending and and higher unemployment, then you can take advantage of that if you're secure in your job and your financial future to maybe buy a property that's going to be cheaper, but you need to sell now. But everything depends on your own circumstances. And I certainly would never buy in this market without having first sold, unless you've got your finances all clear. If you need to sell, because there's too much uncertainty.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And it wasn't until I started digging into it all a bit this morning that I thought, if I'm sitting on a residential piece of real estate and I'm thinking about buying it, selling, I'm doing it now. I'm not waiting the other side of this. We've got $852 billion worth of debt. Will we see a rise to taxation to pay this back?
Yeah, I don't think so. It's funny, it's not that long ago that we had the debt and deficit emergency, and the government with its debt truck driving around Australia and being very, very critical of Labor's response to the global financial crisis. The government's turned around 180 degrees and realised that a fiscal stimulus is the right response to this crisis that they need to support. If you have a look, there's a couple of things here. Interest rates are incredibly low, and we can afford to pay the interest on this debt. It's very, very small as a percent of GDP. Even the total amount of debt that we have as a percent of GDP is expected to peak in coming years at 35% of GDP. Even if that's rosy, and it probably is, and it gets to 45%. We are still that's not the worst that we have ever been. It is so much better than most of the rest of the world. And there's a bit of a consensus amongst economists that once you start to get up to 90%, that's where debt starts to become a problem. But to pay that back, given interest rates are so low, if we can get back through this crisis and get our economy growing faster, we will actually faster growth in itself will increase revenues without actually having to increase the tax rate itself. You will collect more because the economy is stronger. And that's why it's so important now that the government responds in 3 different ways. The first is that initial just get in there and support the economy. The next bit is, as we come through recovery, to have bigger the sort of stimulus we normally see in a downturn, things like the infrastructure investment that they've already flagged, skills development, those sorts of things. But on top of that, then we need to have those productivity enhancing measures. And whether that's things around taxation or industrial relation, or the way we learn our skills agenda, if you like, all of those things would be very good if we can find ways to do them, and if we can get the Parliament to agree. And there's a lot of ifs around that. But all of that's by way of saying there is a way out of this that doesn't involve us having to ramp up our taxation rates. And I think governments are more inclined to lower them than to raise them. The question then is, do we start to see some programs of expenditure start to be cut back once the recovery is underway? I suspect it will be very tempting for the government to do that. It depends who's in government at the time, of course, but there will want to be, this government is the government that printed mugs saying back in the black. They're very keen to get us back to surplus or balance more quickly than most economists would say is necessary. And obviously we do want, can't spend forever. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we just keep spending and spending and spending, but you need to have the right response to a crisis of this amount. The government is right. They are doing much better than, by global standards than most developed economies. And it isn't a crisis. It is something that we can get to. You hear the Reserve Bank governor was saying exactly the same thing last week. And so I think everyone's pretty much on the same page. So I'd say, the risk is not to higher taxes, but there may be some risk in the longer term, not immediately, of some cuts to government expenditure, and that's the thing that we need to watch for, I think, in the future.
I was reading this morning that there are indications around amending or changing how we employ people as a consequence of COVID. I'm really concerned about that we and I was reading, forgive me, I just want to go back to my notes. I was reading, they called it the trickle, and they did this in America.
Oh, trickle down. Oh,
yeah, trickle down economy, where the wealthy get exceedingly wealthy, and then the money just kind of trickles down to the poor because they don't have any full-time, long-term, permanent employment. Are we, as a consequence of COVID, going to head in that direction where we're only hiring casually? Are we going to give up our full-time workforce? What does that feel like to you? Because that would be, I think, really bad for Australia.
Yeah, I have to say the language, particularly from the Treasurer, is deeply concerning. He holds up Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as his sort of economic idols. These are people that presided over dreadful levels of unemployment and sort of decimations of vast sectors of their economy. So trickle-down economics has been proven to not work. If you give companies or wealthier people more, they don't just spend more. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And we've seen that through COVID, is actually the spending that we've had in the economy has all come from low-income people. They are the ones that are spending their money. Higher income people have actually sat on their money and started saving much more. So just let's debunk that theory completely.
Great.
The idea that we had a more flexible IR system while we have the JobKeeper in place is not necessarily a bad one, because there were people who were under JobKeeper as it is at the moment before the changes come in September. Particularly casuals were getting a lot more money than they potentially the hours that they were working for that they had got before. And so some flexibility around that was not unreasonable. To suggest that those sorts of measures can come into place to diminish the power of workers even further is very worrisome. I would say that although a lot of people talk about the gig economy and the casualisation of the workforce, the statistics don't bear this out. If you look at the number of people who are working what we call casual work, it's roughly around 25%, and that actually hasn't changed much over the last 30 years. I know it's quite surprising. It certainly feels different, but it's just the way we're working in those casual jobs is different. And those particular jobs, it's not that we're working more casually, it's that the casual jobs that we have fewer protections. So if you're an Uber driver and you're considered a contractor and therefore you don't have sick leave or the sorts of things that that you might have if you were a typical part-time permanent employee, much lower wages for people, all the people who are out there riding their bicycles to deliver pizzas in the rain to those of us wanting to order meals from home.
God love those people.
Well, we love them very much and we thank them, but they
exactly
are,
right.
unfortunately, and we also know from all of these stories, not only is there systemic underpayment of wages in the sort of formal system, but of course, there are lots of, the cafes and restaurants who are still paying people cash in hand, and paying below minimum wage, So it's not that the workforce is more casualised. It's not. It's that the people who are casualised are potentially have fewer rights and fewer protections in the way that we're structured.
That's a terrible thing, isn't it? I saw that happen. Difficult. I saw that happen in New Zealand, and when I was growing up in New Zealand in the 80s, it was an incredible country, it really was. And then all of a sudden, there was no full-time work. That kind of started to dissipate. And I mean, what's come out of it is this incredible entrepreneurship, which I really love. I find people that can respond to that and be nimble and create empires as a consequence of that to be extraordinary. But there are other people that just don't have the capacity to do that. And that makes New Zealand a really interesting environment to be a part of. I would hate to see that happen here in Australia. And the good thing for me about Australia is that you've got cracking unions here. They're pretty scary guys, aren't they? And there's no way anyone's going to argue with them. What's the good news here? The good news is, I saw Scott Morrison announce that he was really happy to take everyone that was experiencing hardship from Hong Kong. I thought that was a fairly brave move to do, to announce that, and it might be tongue-in-cheek, I don't know if he actually meant that, but firstly, considering where we're at with China, do you think it's a good idea to bring in these people from Hong Kong to stabilise our economy?
So I have to say I'm a bit cynical about this particular policy, and having heard the Trade Minister Thum Bing explaining it, it's really actually the policy is what's in place already. We already take people with business visas who have a certain amount of money that they're prepared to invest in this country. So that's not technically different from what we're already doing. I guess what's unusual is that they're making a public statement in saying, raising the fist to China and saying, guess what, if you don't treat your people well, this is what we'll do. I am alarmed at the rhetoric that is, increasing between Australia and China, and also the US and China, particularly the sort of tit for tat that is going on across the globe. China is a frightening force, to be reckoned with. We have watched this economy grow, to be, by some measures, the largest economy, at least the second largest, depending on sort of metrics you use. With that comes tremendous political power, and we are seeing the Chinese yield that in all sorts of ways, whether it's around the South China Sea or in Hong Kong, in their activities around the world, in trade agreements with us when we do something they don't like. They have very strong levers that they can pull that, we have to be careful about how we respond. So we have to walk this very fine line between defending what is right and protecting, global human rights and decent practices, but also protecting our own economic interests and obviously diversification. It's funny because if you think about when Julia Gillard was in power as Prime Minister, it was all about, we had the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper, and it was all about increasing ties with Asia and especially China. It was every kid should learn Chinese at school. We're going to have greater ties. But unfortunately, that increased reliance that has gone from what used to be with the US 50 years ago is now with China, comes with incredible problems if we don't do the right thing in China's eyes. I think it is a bit of a scary situation that, it's not just the barley or the beef, there's potentially billions if we look at iron ore and coal. But of course, the quality of our mineral exports is such that it would not be in China's interest to do anything about that at the moment. But it is a space we need to really watch and see very carefully. And I have to say, I feel a little bit on edge. If you ask what is the good news,
what's the good news? Let's be optimistic. You and I always manage to do that. We always manage to bring home a good story about all this.
We do. And I think, look, people are probably, we are into our second wave, certainly in Victoria. I think in New South Wales, people, in terms of confidence, are in a second wave, even if we're not quite having the same level of case numbers. The rest of Australia is doing very well, let's remember. And so there is hope for us to get back there. But if we remember, this is not, people talk about a V shape or a W shape, the idea of snapback. We've got past all of that. This is a roller coaster ride, and we will have more of this. But people do need to toughen up a little bit. We had 30 years of uninterrupted growth. So my kids never knew what a recession looked like. And it's fantastic that they didn't. But it also means that particularly younger people are struggling quite a lot. I mean, obviously people who have lost their jobs, who have been sick or lost loved ones, this is hard for them and it's not the end. But we will get to the end. And I think, the generations before us have lived through world wars. Parts of Asia lived through the SARS epidemic, Ebola in Africa. Human beings are incredibly resilient and we do bounce back. It's not fun now, but we have the opportunity to take this adversity and to make something better from it. So I keep coming back to what is it that we can use now? How can we use this situation to pursue an agenda that the International Monetary Fund refers to as a greener, smarter, fairer agenda? how can we take all of this angst and make ourselves a better country? Now, of course, a better country doesn't mean that individuals haven't suffered terribly, and there will be losses through this that will persist long after, the last case of the virus or the introduction of a vaccine. I don't diminish that at all. But we have to hold on to how we can manage this adversity to our advantage and keep that note that we will get through this. It's hard, and it's
You're
hard not to
so
be gloomy,
good.
especially when it's raining all the time, but, and cold. It's doubly worse. But, do the things that are right for you. Exercise, reach out to those that you love, get supports that you want, and know that there is a brighter tomorrow, that we have been through it's similar and even worse. And that, we can do this, but we have to do it together, and we can't be playing blame games or snarking at each other. We really have to stay in this together.
I agree. I was watching 60 Minutes last night, and Gigi, the economist from the university up there, was recommending that we just get out there and get among it without our masks. And we kind of use, is it herded, they call it herded vaccination.
Herd immunity.
Herded immunity. And I just thought, that just doesn't feel right. That feels counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve, which is to eradicate the virus altogether. I get to hang out with you, and you're an economist, and you're positive about the direction that we're taking. You're positive about the money that we're spending. I have to agree with you about the job seekers payment. I don't want to see that go backwards. I looked at the money that they're paying, and it feels to me unreasonable to reduce that down. But I think our response internationally has been incredible. I look at the unemployment rate in America. They don't have a government that does what our governments do for us here. If we were to talk about all
countries, a social support network that we have. You can't get healthcare. You can't get all sorts of things that we take for granted in this country. It's an amazing country, Australia.
This is the holy land of amazing countries, and I'm so grateful that I ended up here. Nicki, you're amazing. Thank you for joining me, and for your positive narrative, and for the fact that like I know, that we're going to be better people for this experience, and we'll get through it unscathed. Thank you. Well, we might have a few bruises, but we can patch those.
I think so. I certainly hope so.
All the best to you and your family. Thank you for joining us today on #GotMoney. For any questions for any of our guests, please reach out. If you have anything for Nicki, I know that she'd be happy to answer your questions, and I'll email them through to her. Take care, everyone, and we look forward to hanging out with you next week.